The Detroit Lions kicked off their first training camp practice as they gear up for the 2023 NFL season. So, what were some of the biggest observations and takeaways from today's practice? We're going to talk about them right now. Hey guys, welcome into the Pride of Detroit training camp observation. I'm Miko, and in today's video, I'm going to give you some of the biggest observations and takeaways I had from the Lions' first training camp practice. And let's be honest, if we're going to talk about one of the biggest takeaways, we have to talk about a really uncomfortable one, which is Dan Campbell announcing to the media that cornerback Emmanuel Moseley is being put on the PUP list. Now, as most of us know, Emmanuel Moseley suffered an ACL tear back in October while he was with the 49ers. And while many of us didn't necessarily expect Mosley to be ready for the first, training camp practice, it's safe to say that finding out that he's being put on the pup list is a bit of a letdown. Mosley was somebody that I was highly expecting to compete with Jerry Jacobs for that CB2 role, and it was a battle that I was very much looking forward to. Jerry Jacobs has spent much of the offseason talking about how he feels like some people have kind of forgotten about him and maybe overlooked him because the signing of Cam Sutton and Emmanuel Mosley almost kind of felt like the Lions were finding their new CB1 and CB2. But even with that was the case, Jerry Jacobs has been a solid corner for the Lions since, he was brought in as an undrafted free agent. And so the fact that they was going to have that type of competition with a guy who already has a chip on his shoulder and a guy in Mosley who was obviously going to be trying to reclaim some of the high performance he had before he was injured, and the fact that we're not getting that is a little disappointing. Now, the silver lining is that while Mosley is being put on the pup list, he can technically be activated at any given point if he is physically cleared to play. Now, the problem with that is that even though Dan Campbell stressed that he wasn't necessarily having a setback with this injury, the way he technically talked about it very much sounded like he's going to be out for a lengthy amount of time and that there may have been something that occurred during his rehab process that is causing him to miss more time than they expected. All in all, I think we can still kind of firmly expect Mosley to have a role on this defense once he's healthy. But as far as the CB2 role goes, as of right now, that role kind of belongs to Jerry Jacobs. Now, some other disappointing injury news that came out of the first day of training camp was that wide receiver Marvin Jones Jr. was also being put on the NFI list. Now, again, this was another big surprise to me as a fan because last time we saw Marvin Jones, he was in good health. Now, obviously, once minicamp ends and before the start of training camp, these players have as much freedom as they want to train on their own, to enjoy their summer, enjoy their families. And so that leaves a lot of room for anything to possibly happen. And again, I'm not speculating that Marvin did anything wrong in this situation. It's very possible that he was just training and probably aggravated some ligament or something on his body that is causing him to miss the starting training camp. Either way, it does provide a little bit of context into why the Lions were probably so aggressive in trading for Denzel Mims. Denzel Mims has a lot of the same characteristics as Marvin Jones Jr. with the size and the speed, but he's younger. So, in the event that Marvin Jones Jr. isn't back quickly from the NFI list, this will give the Lions a really good look at what Mims has to offer them and could potentially put Marvin Jones on the bubble of not making this roster if he starts to miss an extended amount of time. Personally, I wouldn't necessarily go that far in my own personal beliefs, but it is something that's a viable option considering the depth that the Lions will have at wide receiver and the type of competition that's going to be heating up as training camp unfolds. Now, some positive news to come out of training camp is that defensive tackle Levi Onwuzurike is actually avoiding the pup list. And this is really good news for Levi because the last we had heard of him, he was barely getting on the field. I mean, we were talking about a guy that was just starting to be able to walk on grass back in minicamp, and now we're only a couple months, further ahead, and he's going to be taking limited reps during training camp. Now, I think we should really put a lot of emphasis on limited because Levi mostly worked with the third team today. And while, again, some work is better than no work, it doesn't by any means eliminate the fact that Levi Onwuzurike is going to have a very steep climb to making this roster at the end of the day. He still has to beat out Christian Covington. He's still going to have to compete with Benito Jones. And Broderick Martin is a third round pick, which you almost kind of feel like is already guaranteed a spot on this roster. Not to mention, Aleem and Isaiah Buggs are already taking the starting reps, and we saw that tandem work well together last year. At the very least, though, Levi being healthy enough to practice and to be able to actually do football things is a great sign for this team and is a great sign to the fan base. He's going to have the next couple weeks to really get back into good football shape and start to work his way up the roster. Again, I think if Levi's able to stay healthy, he can make a really serious push for that final roster spot amongst the defensive tackles. Now, some additional surprising news, or at least some insight that came out of today's media session with Dan Campbell, is that he addressed the release of kicker Michael Badgley. Now, Michael Badgley was the kicker that the Lions found a good amount of success with during last season, but the Lions recently decided to part ways with him. And when asked about it, Campbell basically put it this plainly. He felt that, or at least the organization felt, that both Badgley and Patterson offered very similar skill sets. And really, they wanted a better look at Riley Patterson, which is a little odd to me personally because they had a good look at Riley Patterson last year, and yet they still decided to cut him. I don't know if this is Campbell's way of admitting that maybe they rushed, into that decision too quickly, or if they just were really impressed with what Riley Patterson was able to do with during his time with Jacksonville. But one thing is for sure, Parker Romo is by no means out of the running for possibly winning this kicking job. Again, Dan Campbell did call him a bit of a wild card because Parker Romo at least is showing that he has the stronger leg, but he still is going to be a developmental project. He's going to be someone who's going to have to learn how to kick at the NFL level. And that sounds weird because you would probably think like, oh, well, how different is kicking at the NFL level than versus kicking at the XFL or USFL? But at the end of the day, we've seen kickers struggle simply by making those leaps from college to the NFL. So there's no reason to think that Romo won't need some level of adjustment as he starts to kick in the NFL. But at the very least, we at least know this battle between Riley Patterson and Parker Romo is still going to be a really interesting kicking battle because, again, the Lions no longer have Michael Badgley to at least fall upon if neither of these guys pan out. One of these guys is absolutely going to have to win this kicker job. And as of right now, it at least looks like Riley Patterson has the leg up on him. No pun intended. Now, some other big observations that came out of the first day of training camp can actually be found on the defensive side of the football. And to be honest with you guys, a lot of the observations that came off of day one of training camp were on the defensive side of the football. And for good reason. The defense is the biggest question mark of this team going into the season. You have the bottom, they were near the bottom in a lot of categories. And so there's going to be a lot of focus on if this team can make a bounce back and make improvements from where they were last season. And as of least right now, the Lions do seem to be shaking things up a bit. One of those shakeups comes in the form of Charles Harris lining up at the Sam linebacker position. Now, Charles Harris obviously started last season opposite Aiden Hutchinson, but with the rise of John Kaminsky, the Lions probably feel very comfortable with rolling John out opposite, Hutch, and trying to find other ways to get these other pass rushers on the field. And the Lions have a lot of them. So Charles Harris is the first to at least be experimented with in a different type of role. And while this may be great news for Charles Harris, it does come at the cost of the competition that we're going to see between Julian Okwara and James Houston, who are likely vying for that backup spot behind Charles Harris at the Sam linebacker position. At least on the first day of training camp, Julian Okwara was taking most of the second team reps, but he was rotating with James Houston. And again, most people went into this training camp or went into the offseason fully expecting James Houston to overtake Julian Okwara for that spot. And it's still very possible that he will. But at least as of right now, the Lions are going to give Julian Okwara every opportunity to win that spot. And it makes sense. They like what Julian brings to them, at least in the potential of as a pass rusher and a run defender. And they at least at this point know what they have in James Houston as a pass rusher. Speaking of a steep uphill battle, safety Ifeatu Melifonwu was another player that many of us expected to have a tough uphill battle to make the final 53-man roster. But if the first day of training camp is any indication, Iffy seems to be fully ingrained at that safety 3 spot on the current depth chart. Now, working mostly with the second team, Iffy was still rotating in and out with both Kirby Joseph and Tracy Walker on the second team. So this at least gives us some sort of indication that Iffy does seem to be in good favor with the coaching staff, and they at least feel confident of using him as a backup safety if the likes of Kirby Joseph or Tracy Walker were to go down with an injury. And this kind of lines up well with what Dan Campbell said earlier in the offseason when he pointed out that, they really like Iffy. They think he's smart. They think he's athletic. They love his physical traits. They just believe that he needs more time on task, which is actually true. if he has only recently made the transition over to safety and he had never played the position before. So while this is not by any means a lock that if he's going to make the roster, it's definitely a good vote of confidence that he's gone his way to not having the tough battle that many of us expected him to have. Now, another player that may have a tough time making this roster, though, is newly acquired wide receiver Denzel Mims. And if, again, the first day of training camp is any indication, Mims is being brought along slowly. Not because of injury, but because he hasn't been on the team long and he probably hasn't had as much time to absorb the playbook as some of the other players. So we didn't get to see a lot of Denzel Mims in team activity. He did get a lot of, individual work, which is great because it allows him to work with his coaches and build up a rapport with his quarterback and his, other wide receiver teammates. As far as what Denzel Mims is going to bring to the team itself, that's going to be TBD until he gets more, familiar with the playbook. Either way, Dan Campbell did go out of his way to say that they like a lot of things about Denzel Mims. They like his size, they like his speed, they like his work ethic, and they believe that he has the toughness that they are looking for in a wide receiver. So it again makes a lot of sense of why they brought him in. But if any of us know how this team operates, when it comes to competition, having the intangibles and having the physical tools isn't enough to necessarily guarantee you a spot on this team. Denzel Mims is still going to have to compete, and he's still going to be pretty much battling probably at the bottom of that wide receiver depth chart to potentially get that wide receiver 6 or wide receiver 5 spot. At the end of the day, I think he has a good chance of getting it, but we really won't know until we start seeing him in these team drills and really working against this Lions defense in training camp. Now, with all of that said, like I said, Dan Campbell got to meet with the media this morning, and one of the biggest focuses of his for today as training camp kind of kicked off was really instilling the fact that he wanted his guys to be safe, he wanted them to be smart, and he wanted them to stay healthy. On top of all of that, though, he also wanted them to have a good focus of the big picture. The Lions have been getting a lot of hype during this offseason. Some of it and a lot of it actually is coming from the fans, but they're also getting a lot of national notoriety and being considered as a playoff contender before the season even kicks off. And Dan Campbell took the time to kind of say, like, hey, I think that's this hype train is getting a little out of control. At the end of the day, he's right in that respect. The Lions have yet to prove anything. What they did last season was last season. And what they are doing now in training camp is all that matters. And it's all that's actually going to help them when, the first week of the season rolls around. So this time in training camp is going to be crucial to understanding chemistry and, working out bad habits and understanding roles and responsibilities. And that's something that Dan's really focused on, even in these first couple practices, finding the guys that he can trust, finding the guys that he feels confident in, the guys that he knows are going to rise to the challenge. Most of those will probably be familiar faces that we all know and love, but there could be a few surprises along the way. That's the beauty of training camp. So I hope you guys enjoyed this training camp observation. If you did, leave a comment below. Be sure to like this video, share it with your friends. And if you're new to this channel, if you've never watched a Pride of Detroit video before, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We're going to be dropping new videos all the time, whether it's videos like this, breaking down training camp or clips from our podcast. There's going to be so much more content on the Pride of Detroit YouTube channel. Also, if you want more information on how and what is going on at training camp, be sure to head over to the Pride of Detroit website where you can get great in-depth analysis from the writers over at Pride of Detroit. And if you're looking for more, Lions content outside of what is here on YouTube, be sure to follow us over on Twitch. We're always dropping new streams and always engaging with our fans over there. So again, I'm Miko over at Pride of Detroit. Hope you guys enjoy this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.